Hello and welcome to Insights, the podcast with your host, Joe Pane. Join me in this deep exploration of our personal journeys from ambition to meaning, where we stop living life fast and start living life deep. This is a journey of waking up and realizing that our lives have never been about us, but about others. True success leaves positive ripple effects on other souls. I believe that success needs to be redefined from our own personal ambitious endeavors to be redefined as the value that we leave and give to others around us. Join me now as we begin this journey to deeper connections, even more fulfillment, some fun, curiosity, life, love, and all good things. Your deeper journey from ambition to meaning starts right now. Hello and welcome to episode 34. Thank you so much for joining me. So a question bubbled up this morning in my consciousness, in my awareness, whatever you want to call it. But the question was, what is the difference between a virtue and a value? And I thought to myself, great question. So I spent some time reflecting on this. I went to my dictionary app and I looked up what a virtue was and what a value is according to the dictionary. And I thought to myself, nah, I'm going to stick with what I think. And after all, you're listening to this because I guess you're curious about my insights. So what is the difference between a virtue and a value? A truly excellent question. So to me, a value is our ultimate emotional compass, as you've heard me refer to many times in these podcast series, that a value is like a emotional state that we want to experience on a consistent basis. A value is like our deepest desires. It's our emotional compass. It's what directs us to be in alignment with what it is that we love to do. So, for example, as I've given in past episodes as well, is if health and vitality is a deep desire for me. It's an emotional compass for me. It's an emotional state I want to experience on a consistent basis. And then there's different ways of actually expressing and experiencing and connecting with that value. One of those is running. Another way is how I express myself. Another way is through my work. Another way is through how I eat, nutrition, etc. There's always different ways. So that's an example of a value. So what is the difference between a virtue and a value? Well, a virtue is an ideal. It's an ideal. Well, what's the difference between an ideal and a value? Isn't that the same thing? That's a fair enough question. So I'm going to say to you like this. A virtue is a standard of living. And by standard of living, I'm not talking economics. I'm not talking about the quality of living. I'm talking about the standard of which you hold yourself, a standard that you will rarely compromise, if at all. It's a standard or an ideal that you may be working toward. And there are lots of virtues. I mean, Aristotle spoke about 12 key virtues. I mean, depending what kind of philosophy you are curious about or that you might follow, there are different menus of virtues. Now, one of my favorite fields is the heavily researched area of positive psychology. I love it because it's pragmatic, it's implementable, it's relatable, and it can be used in life in a heartbeat. And it aligns perfectly to the coaching journey I've been on since 2006 in terms of coaching others and helping others. So what I want to share with you here in this episode are 6 core virtues. These are virtues, or in other words, 6 core characteristics that have been valued by philosophers and theologians, across culture and time. And I'm excited to share these with you because I hope and trust that this will add value to your awareness, to how you see things, how you see life, and so on. So let's have a look at these. And I'll share this with you. There's no particular order to these 6 core characteristics or 6 core ideals or standards of living, but I think they're wonderful and I love them dearly. So let's have a look at these. The first one is the virtue of wisdom. The virtue of wisdom. So this is about how we gather and use knowledge. So the virtue of wisdom is how we gather and use knowledge. So I often say to clients, I often share this with many people in my trainings. You can't learn to swim by reading a book. You can certainly learn a little bit about it, but ultimately you've got to get into the pool to really know what swimming's about, or to know what water's about, etc. Right? To me, it's the ultimate metaphor in translating knowledge into being. So the virtue of wisdom is about embracing creativity, insatiable curiosity, critical thinking. Critical thinking is where we can, thoroughly look at both sides of the coin, both sides of an argument. The love of learning, being a lifetime learner, and having a very clean and healthy perspective are very, very important aspects of the virtue of wisdom. So how we gather and use the knowledge that we become aware of through what we learn, through what we read, through what we listen to, through the power of relationships, or it could be through a mentor, or it could be through a guide, or it could be through a program that you're doing, whatever it is, how that knowledge is only true wisdom when you actually gather it and actually use it and apply when you get into the pool itself. So, being creative, being curious, like actually embracing these qualities into your life for real, not just as a list of interesting things. Critical thinking, looking at both sides of the argument, like when someone triggers you, or when you're presented with a particular conversation, or you're experiencing a relationship that is plugging you in. It's like, well, do you have the awareness and the strength to actually look at it from the other side? That's wisdom. That is the applying and using of knowledge. Having a clean and clear and healthy perspective, of course, leads to a very fulfilling life. So that's the virtue of wisdom. The second one is the virtue of courage. The virtue of courage. So this is a core characteristic of, how we actually face adversity, the will that we have to face adversity. Another word for adversity is the uncertainties in life. And obviously with the whole COVID tunnel and the COVID situation, we all have faced our own versions of uncertainty and adversity. But the virtue of courage involves a sense of bravery, perseverance, persisting against frustration, that kind of thing. Honesty, being honest, most importantly, with yourself, being true to yourself, being authentic, that kind of thing. And another aspect of courage, or a virtue of courage, is that feeling of zest, that enthusiasm for life, that enthusiasm for what you are experiencing, that energy that it goes with that wholeheartedness. I just love that. And so the virtue of courage is a key ideal. So these are standards. So virtue of wisdom, going back to the first one, it's like, well, what are your ideals and your standards around how you gather and use knowledge? When it comes to courage, how is your relationship with uncertainty and ambiguity and adversity? Like, how is it? How do you respond? Like, does it turn your energy up? Does it turn your energy down? Does it, like, what's your attitude toward it? Because uncertainty, adversity, and ambiguity is a core ingredient of life. It's part of life. And if you're not experiencing that, you may be living in a cave. All right. So the third virtue. So that's the virtue of wisdom, the virtue of courage. The third one is the virtue of humanity. The virtue of humanity. And this is a core characteristic that helps us in our one-to-one intimate relationships, whether it's a love relationship or whether it's a friendship of some kind. This is all about love, kindness, and social intelligence. Being emotionally intelligent, being aware of how you're making other people feel by the way that you speak, the way that you communicate. There's a great sensitivity to other people's needs and feelings. And I think that is the virtue of humanity. It's a beautiful, beautiful core characteristic. It's a beautiful standard. It's a beautiful ideal to have in your life. The third virtue is the virtue of justice. So this is not justice in the terms of, it's not justice in terms of, a court of law. That's not what this is. The virtue of justice is about how you help your community, or your own local community, your group-based situations. And by community, I don't mean necessarily literally the community out there. I mean the team that you might be involved in at work, the team that you might be involved in some kind of sport that you play. Having a really solid connection with what fairness means. You don't let your feelings bias your decisions, or you offer equal opportunity to all, as we know. Leadership is another part of virtue of justice. Getting things done and positively guiding others toward their worthy ideals. So the virtue of justice, look, to me, the virtue of justice, speaking plain English, to me, virtue of justice is just doing the right bloody thing. It's just doing the right thing. And I believe that everyone at their core knows what that means. We all know. And our emotional compass, our values guide us as to when we're doing the right thing as against when we're not doing the right thing. So that's a key virtue as well. That's the fourth one. The fifth one, I love this one. This is my favorite one, or one of my favorites. It's the virtue of temperance. Temperance, as some people might say it. The virtue of temperance is where you manage your habits. And get this right. The virtue of temperance is protecting against excess. My Lord. It's about protecting against excess. So in other words, going over the top. Going over the top with what? Going over the top with your eating. Going over the top with your anger. Going over the top with your emotions. Lacking self-regulation in the way that you might cross boundaries of other people, or whatever it might be. The virtue of temperance is having an awareness of how to self-regulate, to be self-disciplined, to be prudent. Prudence, of course, means to be careful about about your choices, to be cautious that you don't take undue risks. Now, there's a balance to that conversation, because there are high-quality risks and low-quality risks. A low-quality risk is a risk that you take that you haven't thought through. You haven't thought of the worst-case scenario. A high-quality risk is a risk that you embrace consciously. And what that means is it's a risk that you ask yourself the fundamental question, well, by doing this or committing to that, what's the worst-case scenario? And if the worst-case scenario was to present itself, could you handle it? And if the answer is yes, you go and take the risk. Does that make sense? I'm sure that makes sense. So that's what prudence in essence actually is. Humility. This is a big part of a virtue of temperance. Humility is where you don't excessively express yourself over the top. You don't go over the top with your emotional expression, whether that emotion is anger or whether it's, whatever it might be, right? So humility is about being modest, letting your accomplishments speak for themselves. I love that. And forgiveness is a big part of a virtue of temperance as well. Being merciful and accepting of others. The Course in Miracles, that book that was written by a beautiful group of authors back in the late 70s, is all about, forgiveness. And to me, forgiveness is all about compassionate understanding. So that's the virtue of temperance, to protect yourself against, excesses of any kind. Absolutely. And the sixth and final virtue I want to share with you here is the virtue of transcendence. The virtue of transcendence. And the virtue of transcendence is the doorway to how we create purpose and meaning. This is where we believe in some kind of larger universe that provides for us some kind of meaning. Some people call it God. Some people call it source. Some people call it universal consciousness. Some people call it the collective unconsciousness. Some people refer to it as some kind of, quantum mechanical wavelength, whatever it might be. Forgive my voice, by the way, because I've just come off a 3-day event where I have been speaking nonstop. So forgive my my voice here. So the virtue of transcendence is the doorway to meaning. It's a healthy appreciation of beauty and excellence in others. It's a healthy sense of gratitude. It's hope. It's being optimistic. It's getting over yourself. It's the ability to laugh at yourself and laugh with others. It's humor. And fundamentally, it's also spirituality. Having beliefs that, there's some kind of beliefs that are related to some kind of higher purpose, or meaning that the universe has, that you fit somewhere within all that. So the virtue of transcendence is fundamentally the meaning that we create. It's, what it is? To me, the virtue of transcendence is the philosophy of living that we have, the philosophy of living. what matters most and what matters least, that kind of philosophy. So these 6 core virtues are wonderful. I love these. They're wonderful standards of living. They're wonderful ideals. The virtue of wisdom, how we gather and use the knowledge that we have. The virtue of courage, how our attitude toward how we face adversity and uncertainty. The virtue of humanity, the compassion and understanding in our one-to-one relationships. The virtue of justice, where we do the right thing. The virtue of temperance, how we protect ourselves against, awful excess, just over the top excess. And the virtue of transcendence, the doorway, the gateway to all purpose and meaning. Love it. So these are the 6 core virtues. And the difference between a virtue and a value is fundamentally that virtues are standards and ideals that have been put together in beautiful language by the best thinkers in the history of humanity. And then we've got our localized values, our local emotional compass, what it is that we have. So, for example, going back to that example of health and vitality, using the so this is how I would apply a value against is not the right word. How I would apply the value or values with our virtues. So, for example, if I go back to that value of health and vitality, how would I apply it to the virtue of wisdom? Well, it's actually using the knowledge that I've learned about how to nutritionalize my body. Nutritionalize is probably not a word you'll find in the dictionary because it's a word that I've just made up. So the value of health and vitality, the virtue of wisdom is, well, the knowledge that I've gathered about health and vitality, how do I use it in my life? That's how I measure it against the virtue of wisdom. Using health and vitality in terms of the virtue of courage. So how I handle adversity. It's especially in the times of adversity, I'll look after myself even more. I'll look after my body, my energy system, my nutrition, my the rent, the highly rented space between my ears, minding my mind and all that kind of thing. That's protecting my health and vitality using the virtue of courage. The virtue of humanity. Not judging others for how they look and what they're going through with their health. We don't know what people's backgrounds are and what kinds of problems or challenges they face with their body or what's going on with the chemicals in their body or whatever's going on. I remember when back in I reckon 20, 30 years ago, I was so quick to judge others for how they looked. It was awful when I look back at that. So the virtue of humanity is having a standard of how we think and our attitude toward compassionately understanding others. The virtue of justice, doing the right thing by ourselves, doing the right thing by our bodies, doing the right thing by our energy, by our spiritual energy, our emotional energy, our physical energy, our psychic energy. The virtue of temperance. How do we measure the value of health and vitality against that? Well, that's pretty easy because the virtue of temperance is about protecting yourself from going against, excess. So the excessive, sometimes there's the temptation to excessively eat. Now, do I do that? Yeah, once every blue moon though, but not every week, certainly not every day, because that's the standard that I have in my health and vitality. So measuring my health and vitality against the virtue of temperance, I compare it to excess versus healthy living. And the virtue of transcendence, I view my body against the virtue of transcendence, health and vitality, as my soul's delicate, beautiful, rare experience of experiencing this physical universe through the energy of my body, through the vitality and the health of how I look after my body, that fundamentally the way I look after my body is a reflection of how much self-respect I have. So my virtue of transcendence, the way I compare health and vitality or measure my health and vitality against the standard of the virtue of transcendence, is to realize that my body is the temporary home to my soul, and that the quality of the experiences of my soul is influenced by the quality of the energy and the vitality in my body. So I hope that's making sense. So what's the difference between a virtue and a value? A value is a localized emotional compass that exists within you. And a virtue is a universal ideal and standard of character, of how you live your life. So I hope that this conversation today has added and expanded your awareness of self and humanity. So I'm going to sign off here in a second because my voice is starting to really run dry. I hope you enjoyed this episode. Thanks for tuning in. Really appreciate it. Hey, just so in case you're not aware, coming up on August the 4th and August the 5th, I have my next free introduction to extended disc, my next free introduction to behavioral profiling. So if you're curious about behavioral profiling, it's a 1.5 day standalone free event. Standalone meaning that it's a training that has incredible value completely unto itself. And for those of you who want to go deeper into the rabbit hole of behavioral profiling, go through with the full-on accreditation training, then that's the extension of that free training. But the free training in and of itself is amazing. Had 191 beautiful souls attend my last Zoom training on the free intro to eDisc or to behavioral profiling about 4 or 5 weeks ago, and it was just a beautiful experience. So if you are curious about behavioral profiling, and August the 4th, 10 till 6, and August the 5th, 10 till 1. If you want to register for that, just go to the website called thecoachinginstitute.com.au, go to Life Coaching Trainings, and then scroll down to August the 4th and 5th, and you'll see it there. All right. So, guys, thanks so much for joining me. I've thoroughly enjoyed delivering the answer to this wonderful question that just bubbled in my consciousness this morning, which is, what is the difference between a virtue and a value? I love that. So I hope this answered your question, or answered the question that I asked. All right. All righty. Enjoy your morning, enjoy your afternoon, enjoy your evening, wherever you may be. And thank you so much for tuning in. And I'll see you in the next episode. Bye for now. I'm Joe Pane, and you've been listening to Insights, the podcast. If you haven't yet, subscribe, rate, and review this podcast. You can now follow my insights on Facebook and Instagram. Thank you so much for joining me, and I'm looking forward to being with you again very soon in the next episode of Insights, the podcast.